Hi, welcome to Deep End. My name doesn't matter. Let's dive in. So, I want to talk to you about Ignatius Loyola. And before I do that, I want to tell you or just remind you about the four major monastic groups that were prominent in the early 1500s and the late 1400s. You had the Benedictines, the Augustinians, the Dominicans, and the Franciscans. The Dominicans were the preachers. So, they're the ones who preached the Bible, and they're called the Order of Preachers. Then you have the Augustinians, and the Augustinians are kind of like the scholars. They're the ones who all have doctorates and they're teaching in universities at the time. Then you have the Benedictines, and the Benedictines are the really disciplined servant ones. And then you've got the Franciscans, and those are the ones with the brown scratchy robes that take vows of poverty and chastity and wear a rope belt and serve the poor and the homeless and the widows. So Ignatius Loyola adds a fifth group to that prominent group called the Jesuits. They don't come about until about 1540 or so. Loyola, Ignatius, his name is actually Inigo, which I think is great. If you've ever seen Princess Bride, he's very much a "you killed my father, now prepare to die" kind of guy. So he is obsessed with the military, and as a young boy, he walks around wearing military garb and carrying his sword all the time, and he wears a cape. And some of his biographers have even said that he would flare his cape out so that everybody could see his sword and his knife firmly in their hilt on his waist. And he's born in a castle, raised in elite society, very well educated, lives the life of a playboy, and joins the military in 15 teens. Joins the military, and his acumen for military leadership and his skill in political discourse leads him to be a very prominent leader. And he goes into many battles with the local duke as one of his lieutenants, and he ends up badly injured at the Battle of Pamploma in 1521, and his leg is just decimated. And so he goes home, and he undergoes several operations. Remember that these operations had no anesthetics, and he has multiple surgeries, and his leg ends up being fixed, but it's shorter now than the other one, and so he walks with a permanent limp. And during the time of his recovery, he read a book called The Life of Christ by Ludolf of Saxony. And this book was heralding the life of Jesus Christ, and great book to read while you're recovering. And he reads another book about the lives of the saints and the monks. So he's especially touched by Francis and Francis's devotion and discipline to the Lord. Of course, a military man would be very impressed by Francis's personal discipline. But Ignatius decides that he's going to follow the path of the Lord, and he says he will become a soldier for Jesus, for the church. He will become a soldier for the church. Now, he comes away completely convinced that unlike Luther and Luther's time of study as an Augustinian, unlike Luther, Ignatius, when he is studying, comes away with this idea that man is completely responsible and able to choose between God and the devil, and he must constantly make that choice. Luther said you are either slave to the devil and sin, or God had freed you to be slave to righteousness. Loyola took the opposite and said, no, it is solely the decision of man, solely the work of man, using those terms, solely the work of man that he would be saved by choosing God over Satan. Now, seeing the Protestant movements in the world, he determines that he is called by God to teach these Catholic doctrines and to stamp out any Protestant influence. So for the next 10 years of his life, from mid-1520s to the mid-1530s, he spends studying and writing the spiritual exercises. So he spends 10 to maybe even 12 years studying and writing and reading in Benedictine monasteries and in universities all over the known world at the time, traveling and undergoing lots of kind of mini pilgrimages to see various things and learn various things. So in 1539, after having completed this track of study and having written a book called The Spiritual Exercises, in which he talks about how to be devoted to Christ and how to learn and study and write and read and pray, very similar to what we would consider Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline. Very similar. It was a conceptual book that taught how to be disciplined in the faith. So in 1539, he asked the Pope if he can start a new order, and he describes it as a military order that would do the bidding of the church. And so great was this fervor for him that he said, if the Pope says up is down, then up is down. If the Pope says white is black, then white is black. He said that the Pope was the arbiter of truth. And so Ignatius Loyola begins the Jesuit, of course the Pope approves, go figure, and Ignatius Loyola begins the Jesuit Order, the soldiers of the church. And so the purpose of the Jesuit Order, as Ignatius kind of wanted to display, was that they would return Rome and the Roman Catholic Church to its previous prominence and power over the known world and over Christianity. So as a result, the Jesuits were used to as the spearhead of the Second Inquisition. The First Inquisition had happened in the Middle Ages, and the Dominicans were kind of the ones that were in charge of it. And now, under the auspice of Cardinal Carafa in 1542, they restart the Inquisition, which is kind of a black mark on history, the Inquisition itself. So Ignatius Loyola begins the Jesuits. The Jesuits are considered God's or the church's soldiers, and there's a lot of negatives here. There's a lot of negatives in the church's soldiers in the Jesuit starting. One, not the least of which, is the extreme devotion to the institution of the church. They laid discipline on other people. That's another negative that we see in the Jesuits. They laid discipline on other people. It wasn't a personal conviction. Religion was not a thing that you needed to be convinced of in your own mind and then follow with your own heart. Instead, it was a imposition on you by the state. There's an extreme emphasis on human will against the Spirit of God leading. And then there's a willingness to do whatever it takes to advance the church's mission. Now here that's different than the gospel. It is not the gospel that drove, or it may have been that he wanted people to know Jesus, but he believed that the church was the sole proprietor of truth and understanding that truth. So Jesuits, Ignatius Loyola and the Jesuits, were obsessed about following the church's rule, the institution's rule. Now, some good things come from Inigo as well. One of them is that he had an extreme devotion to Christ, an extreme devotion to Jesus. And anybody who reads his spiritual exercises can see that, and can see that he really wanted to know Jesus. And he really wanted to know him physically and personally, incorporating things like fasting and praying and studying. He had a discipline towards Christian service, and he urged all Christians to be disciplined in their service to the gospel. So if you are a Christian, you ought to take that in stride and be disciplined in your service. He had a willingness to do whatever it takes. So I think a lot of times in Christianity, we struggle to do whatever it takes to advance the gospel. And yet Ignatius Loyola very plainly had a willingness to do whatever it took to advance the gospel. And then finally, we can read his spiritual exercises and enjoy them and take the good from them and leave the bad. So thanks for joining me in Deep. And that's Ignatius Loyola and the Counter-Reformation, which was done in the mid-1500s to push against Protestantism. Next week tomorrow we'll talk about Calvin. Great to see you. Have a good night, And I hope you take time to breathe today. Now go get to work.